The Equestrian Wasteland. It takes everything, but gives only two things: freedom and dreams. Freedom to choose your path for yourself, whether you will revel in the lawless expanse of the wastes and strike out for yourself at the expense of others. Whether you will remain an unknown survivor to exist and accept the harsh reality to ensure your continued existence, or whether you will attempt to rise up, to be a hero and attempt to fight the wasteland itself. Dreams to believe in the world that you wish to accept or deny, the darkened past, the cold present, or the future that only you can see for yourself, be it an unchanging mire or a land filled with the boundless hope buried deep in those few good souls left in the wastes. Every pony in the wasteland is given those two elements to choose what to make of them for themselves. Every pony, that is, except for the forgotten masses, the slaves. Born into a life with no choice, taken from them not by the wastes, but by other ponies, they toil, destined for nothing more than to be a cold statistic to the future. They have no freedom. They hold no dreams. This is the story of the slave who dared to dream. Fallout Equestria, Murky No. 7, by FuzzyVeeVee. Chapter 1. Flying Without Wings. Slaving in Philly almost makes you wish for a winter rat-up. What was it like to be born a slave? I suppose I should explain something about the nature of being born into slavery, for it is somewhat different from the more common way of simply being captured and forced into labor. You never even know the concept of choice. Your life is little but instruction, following order, following demand. Many would like to believe in the myth of growing up in a harsh environment to become a big and tough pony with willpower to someday overthrow his masters, but unfortunately that was never going to be possible. The truth is that it more often stunts your growth, resulting in a subgeneration of physically small and weak ponies with no education and little true aspiration. How can a pony who has never known the freedom of the outside world ever know what to want from it? Sure, there might be some strong earth pony, powerful unicorn, or rare and agile Pegasus. Some place that once did as the stories say, but let's just say that isn't possible for me and leave it at that for now. Instead, let me tell you about how I came to be where I am now. I grew up a runt, the smallest of the bunch, born to a weary mother sick with taint poisoning in a camp near Shattered Hoof to an unknown father. Suffice to say, given the way mares were treated in the slave camps, my father was likely one of the harsh figures giving us instructions and beating the ones who fell behind on their quota. At first it was cart hauling, but as the years passed and it became clear I wasn't going to get any bigger or stronger to meet my master's expectations, I was instead sold off. My mother had begged and pleaded with them. She had offered anything, including herself, to make them reconsider and keep me there with her. Although the memory is now far gone, I still remember the slavers laughing her off. They told her they could already have anything they wanted from her. We were slaves. We had no bargaining chips. I was sold for a measly 100 caps to a rock farmer off the eastern edge of Whitetail Woods. Torn from the hold of my mother, I was immediately dragged into service upon the blank and lifeless duty of shifting rocks in some inane quest for gemstones. With a change in scenery came a change in hardship. While hauling carts and performing physical labor had broken me physically in the past and hurt my body's development, I now was a lone runt in a slave labor farm, full of other delinquents just waiting for a new body at the bottom of the pecking order. They hurt me, bullied me, and stole my food and minuscule amounts of possessions. I had to learn to sneak out and try to steal some back at nights, and I wasn't always successful. these days I still bear the scars of the lash upon my back. Truly, I wish I could say that this foalhood had taught me how to be an independent, brave, and determined pony like the ones in the legends. But the truth is, I'm not. Being born a slave has one other problem, as I mentioned before. You don't know choice. You don't know how to think for yourself, unless pushed to the absolute boundaries of physical needs like food or water. If a slaver asks you to jump, you ask into which radioactive crater. The thought of escape and a life outside slavery does not occur to a mind who has only ever known the life of the servant to some overbearing master's wishes. I have no free will, no courage to make my own choices, and few dreams of anything more than perhaps a painless death at the end of it all. If any more proof is needed, all I need to do is look at my flank to see the contract that seals the deal. For my cutie mark bears a looped set of chained manacles, their metal bands open and ready to slam shut about my legs below them should I ever fall out of line. Attained the day in which I was controlled more than any other, it is a continual reminder of my subservice to any master. I apologize if I cannot tell the rest of my life up till this point in great detail. From the day I received the most hated cutie mark a pony could have, I was locked into the bad hand I'd been dealt. I suffered the work set in front of me from a half-dozen other masters, as they passed the unlucky runt around for paltry sums of caps each time. I was bullied, beaten, starved, and ignored to the point in which even I began to forget myself. Each year everything became a little more blurry as my life became nothing but an unceasing cycle of work, toil, and deprivation. I didn't even need to go into the wastes to find the worst it had to offer. Or so I thought, for one day my master in Manhattan received an offer he couldn't refuse. A deal from another master far across the wastes, who was seeking any slave he could get his hooves on for large sums of caps. And so once more I was taken unto a convoy of other hopeless ponies like myself, and marched to the next place of labor. But this place was unlike the others, for my next destination was Philadelphia, serving under Master Red-Eye. Upon my arrival, I discovered a hill city of nightmare brutality made real. A living, breathing maze of harsh metal, red-hot heat, and thick, choking smog surrounding a crater filled with deathly magical radiation. The scale was beyond anything I had expected, the workloads beyond what any pony could ever hope to live up to, and an authority commanding us that seemed devoted to a fanatical call for unity. Master Red-Eye often spoke at length to us across the megaphone systems of how we were aiding in the unity that would save Equestria. To slaves like me, all unity truly held was the threat of being dragged away to partake in it. Those poor ponies never did return, nor did any stories on what unity truly meant. To make matters worse for the slaves on a more personal level, that same authority had no hesitations to weed out the weak and use them as examples, to better encourage others to work hard. Unfortunately, as I said, I am particularly weak. I snapped. It was too much for me on my own. The workload broke me and drove me to a mad, cowardly dash for a hiding space where I might shun the forces trying to control me, and just forget it all. I don't remember much about what happened upon that haunting night when I broke from my designated area and galloped into the smoky darkness towards the ruined buildings to hide away. All I remember is they found me. I was punished with the sentence so severe that I scarcely even remember what they did. They hurt me and told me that I was to die soon as an example to others when they held the next event. I was thrown back into my pen and put back on rotation until this occurred, an event I quickly realized was going to be the arena of death. The pit. The pit was to happen tomorrow morning, And so that is my story, leaving me sitting scared in my pen in Philadelphia, alone and battered, waiting to die in the morning. Short story, huh? Yo, run! Looking forward to the show? Voices. They rang through my mind, even as I fruitlessly attempted to sleep in my pen. I couldn't avoid them, no matter where I hid. The disadvantage of being born to a mother sick with taint poisoning was the threat of a minor mutation upon birth. In my case, that meant slightly differently sized ears that were a little too sensitive. Sure, it's a great advantage to eavesdrop. But try having a slave master screaming in your face. It's like shoving a gun barrel in your ear and pulling the trigger. No, not content with a stunted growth, no education, and eternal servitude until the day I die, the goddesses saw fit to give me a damn mutation too. It's part of the reason I always tried to hide from other slaves. The Philadelphia Fun Farms Petting Zoo performed much the same task it once had 200 years ago, keeping living things inside for the betterment of others. I pulled my meager clothing closer to my torso and curled even tighter into the corner of the pigsty. The red haze of Philadelphia drafted in through the one small entrance designed presumably for young pigs. What were young pigs even called? I wondered. One more unknown fact tossed into the pile that had, over life, accumulated in my mind. You scared? Frightened to die? Gonna scream?
We want to hear you scream tomorrow, or squeal like a piglet.
Yeah! Do that! Well, that answers that. There were 3 of them, just outside, long-term slaves of Philadelphia. Each had been dragged in through those gates, kicking and screaming as they were welcomed to the pitiful existence that would become the rest of their lives. I regarded them as lucky. They hadn't been born into it. They had known freedom for a time. They celebrated their small advantage by immediately treating me as some sort of lower class to the moment I had been hurled roughly into the same caged area as the unruly trio. I had been at the bottom of the pecking order many times, but this time it was a true threat. They stole my food, taunted everything I did, and when angry at the slavers, often used me as a convenient toy to let off some steam by beating someone they knew couldn't return the favor. Before long I had taken to hiding in the pigsty of the enclosure, the small entrance too low and narrow to be accessible by any pony bigger than my own small size. It was cowardice, but I didn't care. I hadn't been taught to have any pride or bravery. All I had to do was stay alive until my masters next needed my presence to do work. Even if that work was to walk into the arena to...
You're gonna die, runt.
Beaten! Stabbed!
Shot!
Melted! Bleeding out!
Choked!
To that. Yeah. I hugged myself tighter, half wishing that if I clenched tightly enough, I could simply disappear into the corner. The sty was stifling hot in the warm air of the city, making it impossible to tuck my head into my own hooves without getting wafts of uncomfortable warm breath every time I exhaled. Sleep was not going to happen. Not tonight. Between the taunts, the heat, and my own crippling fear, dreams were the last place I wanted to be. So instead, I remained still and cowered, clutching my few possessions to my underside and softly crying to myself again. It is somewhat embarrassing to admit, but I cried a lot in life. One of the only 2 ways I could find to let out emotion properly to cope at all. To weep and allow it all to flow so often that it had become something of an involuntary reaction to hardship. As anyone can imagine, it had not done any favors for my position as the resident victim, for every slave with even half a mind of wanting false authority. How many times had I simply toiled away pulling carts while sobbing openly, or running back to my enclosure so I could hide and let it all out. The other way was my one permitted vice in life. The item I clutched to myself as though it would somehow save my life. My journal. Under the crimson nightmare and heavy industry of Philadelphia that had become my home and place of work under Master Red-Eye, it had taken on a greater meaning than ever before. I could not read or write. Slaves didn't get taught such things in the wastes, and my mother hadn't had the time or knowledge to teach me herself. No, instead I sketched. It was the only way I could express myself. To put charcoal or graphite sticks to yellowed paper and let my emotions and feelings dictate what I drew. An outpouring of my own personal thoughts on what was troubling me or what things I secretly wanted. But after entering Philadelphia, it also held a second purpose. It was my one little anchor against the madness that threatened to drive me to something stupid. A manner in which I might drive back the closing walls of insanity around me, of abusive slaves, painful workloads, and terrifying masters. When I drew, it let me focus on something else for that brief amount of time. I never looked at my own drawings that much, preferring instead to do more. The voices continued, beginning to expand, to go into detail of exactly how some badass stallion or vicious mare would end my life tomorrow. Part of me wanted to shout at them, beg them to go away and leave me alone. But it hadn't worked the first time I had pleaded with them to let me be. In fact, it had only made things worse. Instead, I sat up, shaking off the stray rotten straw from my malnourished body with a weakened stagger, and I pulled out my journal. Biting the charcoal stick I had stolen from the small stalks we often pulled for work, I began to let myself fall into the trance. Trying to ignore the dirty taste of the stick, I spread out the paper from my journal in front of me. Charcoal met paper, a long, sweeping arc that grew into multiple lines in the vague shape of some pony.
Hey, Run, you crying in there?
Come on out and let us cheer you up. We'll give you something to eat after we're done digesting it.
Voracious laughter followed. Ignore it. Ignore it all. Concentrate on the lines, the shapes, and the curves. Half the time I didn't even know what I was drawing.
Live life to the full, Run, 'cause it isn't like you're gonna have it for long. Oh wait, you don't have any life anyway.
Ignore it. Ignore it. I tried to let my mind focus entirely on drawing. The sound of charcoal on paper, and the meditative bliss the process brought. Let my subconscious do the work.
How does it feel knowing you're going to die?
I was weeping still, even as I tossed the charcoal into the corner with a pitiful whine and clutched the drawing close. I blanked out the laughter and the voices. Their taunts washed over me as slowly I held up my art to look at the finished piece. It held a small pony with different-sized ears, lying dead in a pit, bleeding from horrendous wounds, the leering face of his killer glaring down from above. Trembling, sobbing gave way to fully-fledged crying as I shut the journal sharply with a hoof and cowered once more in the corner as the voices came back all too strongly once again. I woke to a sharp rapping on the outer casing of the pigsty, sending jolts of shock through me, the sound echoing all the louder through my ears and the confined space. Instinct rushed in my veins as I quickly scattered to my feet, grabbed my journal, and squeezed out of the hole into the harsh world. I hadn't slept well. Gunfire from some place nearby had disturbed my sleep multiple times. Some stupid pony losing it and making a run for it, probably. It wasn't the first time either. On my first night, I witnessed a father blown in half by a huge rifle carried by one of Master Red-Eye's griffins for trying to stop them from taking his foal away. A bright red glare forced my eyes shut as I stumbled warily to my feet and gazed about me as the world came back to view. My world. Philadelphia, the ever-reliable industrial heart of old Equestria, now the reluctant industrial machine of the wasteland. Around that lethal balefire crater, its factories, forges, and mills rose like shredded but intact beacons of potential. Under Master Red-Eye's reign, the slaves here had reactivated many of them, or carried out repairs, with scavenged scrap brought from the many stables that pocketed the nearby landscape. After years of renovation, the effect was less of a repaired ruin in some areas, and more of a very unmaintained build if you didn't look too closely to see the weathering from 200 years in the wasteland's weather. Despite the revulsion of my presence here, I found it all genuinely quite impressive. I knew those factories well. They were where I had my slave work broken in tugging overborne carts of twisted scrap and newly manufactured ammunition, where I had been driven through horrific work environments and made to labor in poisonous fumes that made me gag and choke for days afterwards. I dreaded for the condition my lungs must be in after my short few weeks in this living nightmare. Murky number 7, explain to me right fucking now why you are not already on your way to your place of work. I blinked as my eyes adjusted, turning and immediately lowering my head to the ground in a subservice to the unicorn slaver before me, just as I had always been conditioned to. The stallion didn't care for it. A fell blow with his front hoof to my face savagely laid me out on the ground 2 feet away. Nursing a loose tooth and an aching jawline, I felt the unconscious instinct to cry as I cradled my head. But in the dry, warm smog of Philadelphia, my eyes were spent and I could not muster the effort after last night. But place of work? What place of work? Didn't the slaver know I was scheduled to die in a few hours? My voice was weak and hoarse from owing to a rough throat from little water and plenty of heat from the forges. I am to attend the pit later on this morning, Master. I'm sorry, I thought you'd know. His hoof connected with my skull a second time, putting me right back on my rump again. Pain flared through my face as I felt my weakened body giving to the hulking slaver's strikes. Terror shot through me at the threat of further beating. I glanced up at him, with one eye from beneath my hoof, as I felt blood trickling from the edge of my lip. I must have bitten my own tongue. I don't give Celestia's right flank if you're heading off to die in that pit. What makes you think that it gets you off work until the time comes? He stated bluntly, leaning his face down to me. Red-Eye brought you here to work. Now get your tiny rump in gear and get to fucking work. The unwashed stench of his breath nearly made me gag. Damn. But he was right. What choice did I have to not obey a command? Even if I was trying to fight the unbridled terror wrenching my gut at the thought that I was about to be sent to my death. He was my master. I was the slave. Without a word, I nodded profusely and got to my hooves as I glanced upwards at him. My current master, other than Master Red-Eye, of course, was a dull blue stallion, with a filthy cyan mane. He had introduced himself at first as having the name Whiplash. Well, it certainly fitted him, owing to the long coil by his side. He had one hell of a talent with it using telekinesis, something many slaves in the Fun Farm petting zoo pens would attest to, myself included. Looking into those yellowed eyes gave me all the incentive I needed to quickly turn and gallop off across the petting zoo. Slaves often were not kept under shackle and chain in Philadelphia, nor in locked pens for the simple reason of, well, where could we run to? Master Red-Eye's part of Philadelphia was surrounded by a colossal wall to keep us in more than anyone out. As such, slaves were often trusted to run to where they needed to be. If they were not spotted in the right places at the right time, wham! Besides, the real chains holding me were upon my flank anyway. As I crossed away from my pigsty home, I got a glance at that wall in the distance, and reflected on its defenses pointing outwards. Who in their right mind would be so stupid as to attack Philadelphia? If the wall wasn't bad enough, there was the chemical moat that had made me sick on my way in, the energized fences powered by some magical spark generator hidden behind the wall, and the towering guard posts lined with members of Master Red-Eye's army. Oh, and the not-so-ignorable, hideous, pony-head-shaped hot air balloons that eternally gazed down upon us from on high with a pink pony's freakishly large eyes. The same pony who was strewn on every fun farm sign, ride, entrance, building, and advertisement. That same ridiculous grin and poofy curled pink hair that was out of place with everything else in Philadelphia. After just a few weeks in the fun farm, I really, really hated that pony. I exited the fun farm, glad only that my peers had been sent to their own places of labor before I had been woken. After last night, the last thing I wanted was to face them again before I was sent to the pit. Inwardly, I hoped their workplace was someplace dangerous, that I might never see them again, even if I were allowed to live for more than a few more hours. Perhaps the Perisprite pits, or to investigate a stable death trap. I had never volunteered for such things. The big griffin who had greeted my shipment coming in had told us you could earn your freedom through them. However, I was too afraid to risk death seeking something I wasn't supposed to have anyway. Passing the entrance to the fun farm, I paused briefly, as I always did. Contained next to the sign, featuring that damned pony again, was a large mirror, pointed at any pony who would be standing in queue to enter the amusement park. I couldn't imagine what it could possibly be used for, other than making queues seem longer. I moved in front of it. My form was thinner than normal. It was a shaped mirror. How novel. I reached out to wipe dust from the surface for a clearer look. My hoof felt no curve. The mirror was not shaped. It was perfectly normal. That scrawny, wasted figure was myself after almost a month in Philadelphia. Great Celestia, I had never been anything but smaller than normal and possessing thinner limbs, but this was horrifying. I could see my ribs if I lifted up my clothing. I quickly tightened my patched jerkin around me again. Giving myself a once-over revealed nothing more than the ruin that was my body now. Dirty and dark blonde lanky mane? Check. Filthy dull green coat with patches of hair beginning to fall out? Check. Rad sores on my back left and muzzle? Check. Slightly oversized right ear and slightly undersized left ear? Thin-haired tail? Cutie mark bearing those gnashing manacles? Check, check, and I sighed, check. Just your humble and pitifully weak earth pony here. Minus the things earth ponies are often known for. Not shown, the painful wrenching of my stomach crying out for sustenance and fuzzy-headed fevers that spoke of building radiation poisoning in my blood from the foul air and workplaces. Even without the pit, I began to rate my chances at survival for another month very low anyway. I raised a hoof to my face, dabbing my damp eyes at the soul-crushing sight of my own body being so irreparably hurt. Apparently my tear ducts weren't quite done yet then. I wanted nothing more than to collapse off my weary hooves and curl up on the ground, but long-conditioned instincts propelled me to continue. I had work to do, even if I didn't want to do it anymore. Turning from the mirror, I set a pace towards the armor manufacturing facilities. Road signs were useless to me, my inability to read rendering them defunct. Briefly, I wondered if they even meant the right things anyway these days, as I stared at the tall, rectangular sheet of metal on stands just outside the fun farm. It was bent away from the crater, clearly having been jostled by the missile as it struck Philadelphia, and never truly fixed. The words on it were undecipherable to me, a mixture of dots and lines that held secrets I would never understand. Words were not my thing. Shape and form was more my area of understanding, to sketch and shade in those quiet moments between shifts. However, there were 3 words that I knew. 3 words I often wondered about. Murky number 7. My name. Like some sort of sick joke to poke fun at some pony when he's already down. The not-so-lucky one. Ha-ha! Laugh it up, every pony, at the slave with this silly name. That said, the exact circumstances were a little unknown to me, although you could logically piece together some of it. I was not an only child. My mother had been in the possession of a few masters in her time, and had the attentions of various slavers, too. I had been the 7th foal she gave birth to. I had no confirmation that this was the exact reasoning, nor did I like to think it as the true one, for it pointed at my caring mother as someone devoid of imagination and life to the point that she would number her own children. As for Murky, well, you only needed to look at the color of my mane and coat for that one. A particularly loathsome slave I had once worked alongside in Manhattan had once told me that it was because my mother hadn't truly cared for me at birth. Because I wasn't an intentional child, hence the sick joke of a name. I knew her better. Even if that were true, she changed as I grew around her. Briefly, I paused in the road. It struck me suddenly that tomorrow my own mother wouldn't even know I was dead. I galloped the rest of the way to the factory in tears, my eyes finally proving that they could find enough effort to cry any time, as I sought only the familiar, lonely toil of a slave's life to help me forget my own stupid wishes. The armor factory loomed over the motionless and ruined hovels surrounding it, the places where I presumed workers had once stayed close to their site of work. The run to the site had long exhausted the emotional hurt I had brought on myself. Instinct and conditioning forced it unwillingly to the back of my mind as I stepped past the thick metal gates, feeling my lungs already burning from the exertion of arriving at all. As I galloped past workers' quarters, I briefly wondered what it was like back then, to have choice of what you do in life, and no pony telling you what your day is to include. I pictured a young mare turning away from her Cutie Mark's proclamation of being a seamstress, to instead do it only as a hobby while working as a baker. How did anyone choose what they truly wanted? When given everything, how do you know which route to take? What crusade would any pony undertake to find the thing they truly wanted? Sometimes I wondered if being instructed was not perhaps so bad compared to that insurmountable choice. Looking into the red-hot forge ahead of me, the warmth mixing with the dry air to blast my wet eyes into dryness once more, I wondered who would choose to work in a place like this. The factory office had been converted into the resident slave master's hub of activity. As I approached, surrounded by scalded and dire-faced ponies slaving away in the metal presses and molten vats, I could see her up above. Wicked Slit. A unicorn mare, bearing just as wicked a blade, that hovered alongside her. When not around her, some of the slaves made occasional jokes as to whether her name meant the knife or, well, something else. The one slave who had rebelled and told it to her face had lasted 3 unthinkable days regretting why that had been a bad idea. Right now her hooves rested on the railing, her horn magically enhancing the volume of her voice to be heard over the din as the blade floated casually to and fro beside her.
You lot! No! You lot! Get up off the damned floor! You wanting to get dumped in the vats? Because it's all you're good for if you just lie around.
I turned, seeing 3 ponies collapsed on the floor, 2 male earth ponies and a female unicorn. The earth ponies had scorch marks around their face from grabbing scalding hot metal by accident in what I knew to be from work in the refuse yard. Some of that stuff stayed hot for days without showing it. I'd once stepped on one myself. All were clearly suffering from a lack of water and too much heat inside. Even as I watched, under the factory master's barked orders, a couple of slavers began hauling them off. Too weak to even fight back. For their sake, I hoped the master was not intending to hold up on her sick promise. Only then did I notice her eyes watching me, foolishly standing around with no work to do.
You get up here now. You're late.
Bobbing my head to show understanding, I quickly headed for the skeletal metal stairs rising above the shop floor of the armor facilities. As I climbed, the view let me fully grasp the weight of Master Red-Eye's intentions. There were hundreds of ponies in this place alone, and this was only one factory. Sparks flew from heated metal as it was machined into place and cut upon conveyors. The sound of whirring cogs and the scream of tortured metal as it was warped and forced into new angles assaulted my eardrums. I had once asked for earplugs. Wicked Slit had asked if I'd prefer them cut off instead. Steam rose and enveloped the walkways that were thick with guards bearing long rifles and gas masks. Oh, how I envied those masks. Any relief from the poisonous air. A few even wore battle saddles. I envied them too. Call it a silly wish, but I'd always wanted one of those things, even if I had no use for it. Something about the mechanisms and the artful measure of weights and machinery lit a wishful appreciation into the artistic side of my mind. Perhaps one of those lighter ones that I could wear and hang things on would fit best. Briefly, as I trotted through the master's open doorway, I wondered if I might be able to get one in my last few seconds of life inside the pit. That'd be nice. The darker and larger part of my brain immediately reminded me that it isn't so nice when it means you are getting beaten to death. The bully's words came flooding back into my mind.
How does it feel knowing you're going to die?
Choking back a reaction, I clattered over the lethally haphazard catwalks towards Wicked Slit's door. Inside, the office was marred with old furniture around a rotted wooden desk bearing one of the indecipherable terminals. I hated those things, whirring away with hidden secrets that I couldn't read, like something put on Equestria just to spite my illiteracy. Wicked Slit sat behind it, holding a cigarette magically in front of her mouth as she typed up, presumably, a report on the 3 slaves she needed replacing. Around her sat various scraps of her life, cigarette stubs and packs, a couple of half-empty bottles of sparkle cola, and her prized possession, a wickedly curved knife that permanently stood upright with the blade embedded in the wood. Her desk was covered in the pockmarks from the tip from each day, but not as many as were left on her slaves. Once she had slit my back, just enough to make the wagon harness rub it all day. Wicked Slit had a fiendish imagination with that blade. Right now, she didn't even look at me as she spoke in a surprisingly polite voice, belaying her ruthless attitude. Do you know, Murky number 7, how many slaves we lose on a daily basis? I shook my head. Frankly, it wasn't something I cared to think about. All I knew was it was no small number. About to be one less, my mind oh so joyfully reminded me. Every few days, a slave in my enclosure just wouldn't wake up. Toxic air was a major killer. Smog in the lungs and infections forming within every small wound you received were lethal too. She didn't look up. I didn't hear you, she intoned. The words carried underlying threat. Of course, she wasn't looking at me to see my shake of the head. I don't know, Master, I replied, stammering. My voice sounded so small beside hers. I'm a mare, Murk. She still didn't even turn from her work on the terminal. I don't know. Ma'am? I tried instead. Funny, most female slavers preferred Master as well. I presumed she had some trouble with her stallion peers to gain the same level of respect in an environment given to masculine ego and shows of strength. If anything, it made her seem all the more lethal as I risked a glance and saw the puckered scars across her face. Even a crack running up her horn. Casting magic must have been agonizing for her. It spoke volumes of her willpower, as loud as her voice, I guessed. She sat up, looking directly at me. I had forgotten something. To say it at the end too, perhaps? I don't know. Is it? Ma'am? I muttered, trying not to look her in the eye. Or perhaps she was one of those more militant types from Master Red-Eye's army. They liked it at the beginning as well. Ma'am? Her left eye twitched dangerously as she shoved the heavy terminal away with her magic and leaned over her desk at me. Suddenly, I had some very nasty imaginative thoughts about that knife and varying parts of my body. Do you think you're being funny, Murk? Or clever? She intoned dangerously, the knife pulling itself out of the wood without a sound. Damn, that thing was sharp. I shook my head. I didn't want to risk anything else. Why had I gotten so chatty anyway? Perhaps the knowledge that I was about to have my throat torn out and left to painfully bleed to death had made me careless. My imagination became a very imminent reality as the knife flew over and rested against my throat. My squeak of terror stifled itself as I dared not move my throat in the slightest. But I felt the sweat of fear running down the back of my neck as its oddly cold surface rested, ready to pull to the side if she decided to just get rid of me for back-talking her. "The truth is, Murk," she began again, "too many. And do you know why?" She didn't give me a chance to reply. "Lack of effort. Red-Eye expects every one of you to do your utmost best. Have you listened to his broadcasts?" I could hardly avoid them. Every night they echoed around my pen, blasting speeches of a greater future, of our sacrifice being for the good of our descendants, and the survival of Equestria into better days. I had often heard slaves arguing, some claiming that perhaps he was right, and if they just put their backs into it, they might somehow save themselves too. Others defied him. Quietly, of course, but would happily curse his name into the ground, all the while groveling for forgiveness if any of those fanatical griffins heard them. Me? I didn't really think either way. One way or another my purpose was to serve. If it were Master Red-Eye that commanded me to do this, I'd do it. What else was there for me to do? "Red-Eye expects much of you slaves, and us slavers, Murk. And examples like those three down there are not good enough. It's enough to make me just want to start shooting every slave I see for insulting our great leader." Great. She was a fanatic too. Oh, my wonderful life. Which brings me, of course, to you, Murk. Shit. Given that you were 10 minutes late, do you know how much you have delayed Red-Eye's plans? Care to take a guess? She grinned sweetly, finally looking at me. Sweet Celestia, she was actually so angry she was grinning. Shouting I could deal with. I'd been shouted at all my life. Painful on the ears as it was. At least you knew someone who shouted wasn't about to do something, I gulped internally, unpredictable. Well, it wasn't my place to argue back. Time to take a guess. 10 minutes, ma'am? I hazarded. After all, why wouldn't it be? Apparently that wasn't what she wanted to hear. Her hoof slammed on the desk, sending splinters of the rotten wood spraying to each side, and leaned over it toward me, her knife moving away from me. Instinct kicked in. I bowed my head down and knelt my front legs.
10 minutes.
Her voice echoed with magical power. I squeaked in pain as the noise assaulted my ears.
Try an hour, Murk.
Huh? As I lay there, hooves covering my ears, I struggled to grasp just where this magical number had come from. 1 hour! You being late by 10 minutes cost one trip with the scrap wagons to the ammunition factory, where the smaller scrap would be needed. Now, because they lack that extra cart, they will have to run an additional cycle of the pressing machine. This, as you can imagine, takes additional resources that they will now need to order in from the resource silos. I have in front of me a particularly poorly spelled message of swearing sent from the slave master in the old iron-shod factories, wondering just what I am doing wrong here. Tell me, Murk, if you are beginning to grasp the weight of you not pulling yours around here. She bellowed, teeth clenching between each sentence. Well? Yes, I began, my words feeling like a whisper against the wasteland storm. I understand my mistake. I am sorry for— Don't be sorry! She speared right into my sentence. Be better! That cart needs taken now, along with a dozen others. Everything has to act like a well-lubricated machine in this city if we are to achieve our great leader's dream. I want to see at least 7 more deliveries by the end of the next hour, or so help me, I will personally ensure that you will not return here tomorrow. I won't be anyway, ma'am, I spoke up, finding at least some solace in that I would be escaping her after the next few hours. Her eyebrows rose with disdainful fury at the interruption. I'm to attend the pit later this morning. I couldn't resist it. She'd made my life a nightmare for the past week working under her supervision. I still bore a burn on my neck where she had put out her cigarette on me as her method of trying to show me that the molten metal sparks wouldn't hurt as much as defying her. The bullying last night had worn on my mind. The knowledge of death being so close anyway drew a certain carelessness to my words. Instinct led me to merely mutter them under my breath rather than blurt them out loudly. So I presume you will have to find a 4th slave as well after I'm gone, ma'am.
Excuse me, Murk?
Her voice drew enough of a picture of what would happen if I had said that any louder. Care to repeat that? I prayed to the goddesses that she had only thought I had just not spoken loud enough. She must have seen my lips moving, of course. Instinct was currently bucking my brain hard for saying that to the mare whom had just been threatening my windpipe with a blade a few seconds ago. Well, there goes my attempt to be snarky for the day. I said, ma'am? My voice was shakier than before, the imminent threat of that wicked curved knife all too clear as it slowly and methodically began to stab the desk in perfect beats. That I should probably, She had advanced towards me, trotting right up to glare me in the face. Oh, goddesses, not the face again. It still hurt from whiplash. Go on, she intoned, dangerously. That I should hop to it? I tried to smile, to grin my way past it. She did not seem impressed, backing me up right against the doorway before turning away from me. Then why are you still here, Murk? That was my cue. Any slave would recognize a lifeline when they were thrown one. However, as I got up to my hooves and made to turn to the door, warning bells rang in my mind. Wicked Slit doesn't throw lifelines. She severs them. I tried to dive for the door as I caught her movement from the corner of my eye. Too slow. Her full buck catapulted me through the doorway with a cry of shock and pain as my ribs, half bruised already, screamed in agony. I lay against the catwalk's dangerously open edge. Seriously, who designed these things? Clutching my chest as I looked up to see the door telekinetically slam in my face. With a sigh, I let my head hit the metal plating once more in relief as I tried to convince my aching body to get up. All potential outcomes considered, I thought that had gone pretty well. Perhaps it says something about slavery that in my last day upon Equestria, I used the time being whipped while pulling a cart laden down with sets of heavily armored barding between a factory floor and the iron-shod firearms depot on the far side of Philadelphia. Either that or I had some really weird tastes. It was approaching late in the day by the time that the slaver finally, mercifully detached me from the rusted and chafing harness. I swear it was going to leave a stain, and sent me on my way home to the fun farm, happily reminding me that I was going to make his bets very easy later on. The moment the harness was released, my legs gave out. What little strength I had to carry half the trips of most ponies had worn me out completely to the point that if I had ever entertained thoughts of actually fighting, I might have wanted to complain about how this was unfair. Unfair. Welcome to Philadelphia. Murky. I staggered from the colossal factory through one of the delivery doors. Along the edge of the storage flats were rows of non-functional and long-rusted Pegasus skywagons for hauling cargo from Philly all the way to, well, wherever in Equestria it were needed. I pictured strong, free Pegasi swooping to and fro with huge weights upon their wagons, carrying them as though they weighed nothing more than a feather, to be met happily as they made deliveries of, well, absolutely everything. It was hard to imagine, for it required Pegasi to be anything other than universally loathed by the wasteland I had seen. Scummy Sky Dwellers was the popular name to my last master, as he drunkenly ranted about how they kept it all for themselves and how he couldn't wait for them to come down to the waste so he could give them a piece of his mind. Yes, the wastes hated Pegasi. I certainly hadn't heard of any living down here myself yet in my lifetime. Probably for the best, given how they might be treated. Pulling my jerkin a little tighter, I cast a glance about me. Various slaves were trudging their way back towards the fun farm, clearly seeking a chance to rest their hooves before the slavers worked out where to send them next. A typical day in Philly. Perhaps an hour of sleep, a little slop or oatmeal watered down, only usually with water, and almost every other hour dedicated to the work or travel between said work. I couldn't honestly say I knew a slave who had survived more than a few months at most. They looked a sorry sight, even by my standards. The veterans of Philadelphia. Boils and scabs of infected and savage wounds from Master Red-Eye's workers, machines, and even other slaves coated them. Most had tried to tie off wounds with scraps of fabric, while others simply still just bled openly as they limped and shuffled across the broken landscape of the city. Even to a born slave, the sight was horrifying. My eyes traversed further, meeting the wary glances of various guards on tall catwalks, running between the ruins that acted as their barracks throughout the city. One of them re-angled to point his battle saddle at me, and made a jerking motion with his head. "Move along." I didn't dare hesitate for him to ask again. I fell in step with the rest of the trotting slaves, just another little cog in the machine, albeit one about to be cast out. The crush became tighter as they filled through the manufacture site's gates, leading to me bumping flanks with other ponies on both sides. The smell was enough to cause me to almost dry heave on the spot as I witnessed their dirt and blood rub off on my own jerkin and flanks, smearing over my cutie mark. I shuddered, trying to block it out by closing my eyes and trotting on. It's not like I could get any dirtier anyway, right? It was a mistake. My hoof caught a rock as I felt my balance stolen from me, and I fell headlong under the mass of slaves, whom were beginning to pick up speed. A gunshot sounded as they were given incentive to hurry and let the next group through. Panic shot through me as I felt myself dragged down under their hooves, along with a few other unfortunates, and trapped underneath the stampeding rush of filthy slaves. I screamed. I begged them to stop, to let me up. None heard me as hooves cracked against my sides and face. Pain threatened to overwhelm me from the ceaseless crush. It was hard to breathe from all the dust kicked up. Claustrophobia fought with pain for my attention as both swarmed through my mind. I tried to pull myself through it all, and away before any pony. A hoof landed on my leg. With a fierce intensity, pain flared from the joint, as it was wrenched far past the limits of its movements. I am sure that my cry of pain was audible above the entire crowd as I felt hooves grasp around me and pull me out from under the mass of slaves, dragging my dead limb with me. Dumped on the rocky piles either side of the road, I lay back and took a deep breath, feeling the air rush to my lungs, away from the dust, before coughing heavily as my lungs rebelled from their infections. A movement beside me perked up my ears and caused me to half pull back in fear. "Whoa there! You all right?" Amir's voice. I spun to look, yelping in pain as my leg reminded me that it still wanted my attention too. A young unicorn was half crouched beside me, hoof extended as though about to have touched me. A gentle, creamy yellow coat with a thin, two-tone mane of light orange with incredibly thin, hazy red streaks. Her mane was, like every slave, filthy and bedraggled. I got the sense that she might have had her tail as long as her mane, but the end looked like it had been torn off. Hell, her entire look would have been vibrant and flowing, had she not been dulled and battered as a slave like myself. She wore an alien look, one I didn't properly understand until memory began to kick in and remind me that it was a face of concern. The last time I had seen that was on my mother. Internally, I forced myself not to break down again right in front of my temporary savior and forced myself to speak. I guess so, I hesitantly stammered, voice low. Social skills were not among my chief abilities. Wait, I guess so? While I'm sitting here with a possibly broken front right leg, a loose tooth from 2 blows to the face earlier, bruised ribs from a wicked slit, lash scars on my back, sick, infected, probably dying of radiation, and about to assuredly die in under an hour? Yeah. Really okay, Murky. She didn't seem to believe me either. Leaning forward to gently help me to my hooves before some guard spotted us, closing my eyes, I gritted my teeth as I tried to move the injured leg. With a grunt of pain, I bent the joint as normal. It wasn't broken, badly sprained, but the joint was still intact. I let out a sigh of relief before staggering and promptly fell over once again, with a soft "wood." Perhaps I'll lie down just a little bit longer. You're lucky you weren't killed under there. The mare continued to speak, nursing my leg briefly before sitting back, her gaze passing over me. From the look on her face, it was clear that, even though she was trapped in here too, she considered me a particularly weakened-looking pony. Now, come on, we need to get going. I can't be late or— Yeah, I know the feeling, I muttered with my eyes averted. Talking too much wasn't my place. I half expected a slaver to come around any second and beat me for talking at all. Testing my weight on a limb, I stood. As I did, my saddlebags revealed themselves to have been torn in the stampede, my sketchbook journal tumbling out on the ground before the mare. Blinking, she looked down, nosing it open with her, nose. She was probably too tired to use magic right now. I made a move to retrieve it, only pausing as I noticed she was actually looking, not laughing or trying to steal it. Instead, I just waited, feeling oddly full of apprehension as she flicked a couple of pages while I trotted to and fro, trying to work the movement back into my foreleg joint. I didn't even yelp in pain to not disturb her oddly peaceful-looking investigation. Well, not more than twice anyway. Certainly no more than 4. Perhaps 6 if squeaks counted. This is pretty interesting stuff, she commented, eyes not leaving the picture I'd drawn of the Philadelphia gates. My first night here. She flicked some more, before smirking and stifling a laugh. Seems you have a liking of mares, though. She looked up to me and grinned. I blushed and fell back a little. Rubbing my head with a hoof, I tried to think of an excuse. Truth is, well, perhaps I did sometimes find my subconscious drawing out a particularly nice-looking mare I might have seen or worked beside. I'd always intended to add the clothes. Honest. I stepped in, albeit painfully, closing the journal with a hoof. That stuff was still private, no matter what strange spell of peace she seemed to exude to make me not have grabbed it from her the moment it fell. I just blushed as she giggled slightly at the act, seemingly not offended before standing to her own hooves herself. I'm sorry, I began, trying to keep my voice steady above embarrassment. I should go. She just nodded, apparently understanding, before knocking a tangled knot of hair behind her ear with a hoof. All right, then. Off you go before we get caught. The mare bit her lip, and her eyes fell on the sketchbook again, resting at my side. I really do envy that. The ability to draw whatever you want, whenever you want. It's like an escape, isn't it? What? An escape? What on Equestria was she talking about? Drawing was just automatic. I couldn't choose what to draw. Could I? The mare was turning to go. She trotted away toward the opposite entrance of the fun farm, clearly a resident of another enclosure, possibly the bumper plow pit. I wanted to say something, to try and make up some excuse for some of the pictures, to ask what she meant by drawing what I wanted. But she was already too far away, and I dreaded shouting with slavers around us, with ever watchful eyes for dissent and rule-breaking. A little voice began to ask me in my mind why I hadn't been afraid of her, and why I had a sudden urge to draw her, not like the pictures she had seen, but as, well, what I saw. A strangely at-ease slave. The thought struck my mind. Just one last sketch before I headed off to the pit. What were they going to do? Sentence me to death? Justification in my mind, I quickly, figuratively speaking, made for the petting zoo and my hidey-hole in the pigsty. I looked back once or twice at the mare heading off. I could swear she was doing the same.